In the 1960s, rail preservation took off. Many organizations, museums, and individuals worked tirelessly to preserve pieces of railroading past. One of the most important people involved with rail preservation was New England millionaire and seafood tycoon F. Nelson Blout. In the days of his youth, when steam was dying out in Maine, Nelson formulated an idea of creating a museum to preserve iron steeds to not only display, but also operate on public excursions. Beginning in 1955, Nelson began assembling a fine collection of American, Canadian, and European engines and rolling stock. In the following years, his railroad collection eventually formed the foundation of Steamtown USA, a living history museum where visitors could view Nelson's collection of railroad equipment and take a ride on an active steam-powered train ride through Vermont's serene landscape. Steamtown saw success and growth in its early years, eventually finding itself in Scranton, Pennsylvania, far removed from its New England roots. This raises one central question: what happened to Steamtown?
Everybody's moving across the town. The skyline grows and the cut of the clothes is enough to turn you around. Oh, the future is just an hour away and the hearts of youth are aflame. Everybody's moving, nothing stays the same.
Francis Nelson Blout was born on May 21, 1918, in Warren, Rhode Island, to Willis and Ruth Blout. Growing up, Nelson and his brother Luther assisted their father working at the family's ice company, founded in 1919. In between work, Nelson visited the local New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad yard near his home. He fell in love with the railroad, and the die had been cast. On May 23, 1933, Nelson skipped school to see the famous Royal Scot passenger train on display in Providence, Rhode Island, en route to the Century of Progress Fair in Chicago, Illinois. While there, he stumbled across schoolmate and fellow rail fan Frederick H. Richardson, and the two became lifelong friends. Richardson later served as an employee and business partner for Blout during his future ventures. In the 1930s, Richardson and Blout penned the book Along the Iron Trail, released in 1938, one of the first popular railfan books. Throughout the 1930s, the two friends chased trains together and frequently visited the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad and the Bridgeton and Harrison Railroad, a pair of 2-foot gauge railroads located in the state of Maine. The abandonment of the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad had a profound and deep emotional impact on them. As a result, the two began dreaming about how they could save steam-era railroading. Alongside Nelson's interest in real trains, Nelson was an avid pilot, had a love for the sea, collected model trains, and was a big game hunter. Nelson achieved great financial success with the Blout Seafood Corporation. He became a millionaire and used a portion of his wealth to purchase the Edaville Railroad in the 1950s, located in South Carver, Massachusetts. Following the acquisition of Edaville in 1955, Nelson began to build a collection of standard gauge railroad equipment. Nelson's first standard gauge piece was Boston and Maine 1455. The collection of railroad equipment grew rapidly, and Nelson quickly realized the Edaville site could not accommodate his expanding standard gauge collection, so he needed to find a larger site for his collection. Nelson found a more suitable location on the grounds of the Pleasure Island Amusement Park in Wakefield, Massachusetts. He worked out a deal with the park's owners and temporarily displayed select pieces from his collection in the park from 1959 through 1961 as part of the Engine City exhibit. However, his collection rapidly outgrew the Engine City site. Nelson realized that in order to fulfill his dream of being able to run his larger standard gauge locomotives on his own railroad, he would need a larger location. In December of 1960, Blout purchased the North Walpole, New Hampshire engine facility from the Boston and Maine Railroad. Nelson envisioned creating an operating museum to educate the public about the age of steam railroading. He decided to name it Steamtown USA. Nelson met with New Hampshire state government officials to discuss the possibility of creating a state-funded steamtown. In April of 1961, Nelson created the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern to provide train rides for Steamtown. He wanted to operate the excursions over the Cheshire branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad from North Walpole, but the railroad was unable to draw up a lease agreement fast enough. In record time, the excursions were switched to the Claremont and Concord Railway. The excursions were scheduled to operate between Bradford and Sunapee, New Hampshire in the summer of 1961. Nelson hoped that these excursions would drum up excitement for the creation of a permanent Steamtown Museum and Steam Railroad near Keene, New Hampshire. The consist for the 1961 season consisted of Canadian National 47, a 1914 Canadian National 464T commuter tank engine, and several Boston and Maine wooden coaches. The 47 operated for 5 weeks until August 25, 1961, when the Interstate Commerce Commission ordered that the locomotive be removed from service. The Canadian National had disposed of the locomotive's maintenance records when the engine was retired. Consequently, several maintenance records were missing from the MS&N's maintenance log. When the paperwork was sourced from Canada's Board of Transit Commissioners, it revealed that the engine had been due for boiler work prior to its retirement, work which the Canadian National had not performed. Facing costly boiler work, Nelson decided to remove the locomotive from service. The remainder of the 1961 excursions were pulled by a Claremont and Concord Railroad diesel. The season ended earlier than expected on September 17, 1961, and Nelson opted to start from scratch the following year. In 1962, Nelson hoped to proceed with his original plan for the MS&N to operate over the Cheshire branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad. While Nelson had considerable financial resources, he could not support the construction of Steamtown all by himself. He proposed that the state of New Hampshire and the city of Keene fund the construction of the museum. He would make his private collection available to the state and provide train rides over the Boston and Maine's Cheshire branch with the MS&N. Initially, city and state officials were enthusiastic. $1 million of a state recreation budget was allocated for the construction of an 11,000 square foot display building, a 40,000 square foot roundhouse, a covered entryway, ticket booth, 2 stations, a coaling tower, a water tower, and a turntable. The state voted to support the project in principle. The Boston and Maine worked out an agreement with Steamtown to allow the MS&N to operate over the Cheshire branch between Keene and Gilboa from July to November. As excitement for Steamtown grew, Nelson wanted to start running excursions as soon as possible. For the 1962 season, the MS&N selected a Rahway Valley 15 from Nelson's collection and fired it up in June of 1962. The Boston and Maine wooden coaches from the previous season returned along with a newcomer to the fleet, Boston and Maine diner lounge car Mountaineer. The inaugural runs took place on July 13, 1962. The operation enjoyed record ridership in the fall and winter, but a major problem arose. The state would not move forward with the project unless the state or Nelson owned the trackage, a 22-mile stretch of the Cheshire branch between Keene and North Walpole. However, the Boston and Maine was hesitant to sell the line. A draft sale agreement was finally reached in November 1962, but by then, a number of the project's supporters in the state government had left office. To make matters worse, there were a number of skeptics in the press who questioned whether the state should be involved in funding this kind of business. In February of 1963, state officials rescinded their support of the Steamtown project. So, Nelson decided to take matters into his own hands. Nelson announced that Steamtown USA would open on May 19, 1963, at his North Walpole engine facility. At the time, Nelson's collection at North Walpole consisted of 25 steam locomotives, 8 cabooses, a steam shovel, a steam roller, a steam crane, a traction engine, a wooden snowplow along with various passenger cars and other rolling stock. The collection primarily consisted of Canadian and American locomotives, along with select pieces of British, French, German, Irish, and Belgian railroad equipment. The MS&N provided excursions for the museum, with number 15 and the former Boston and Maine coaches. The excursions operated from North Walpole to Westmoreland and return. Fall foliage trains ran a longer distance from North Walpole to Gilboa and return. Steamtown became very popular and had hosted 10,000 visitors by July 25, 1963. On June 28, 1963, Nelson created the Steamtown Foundation for the Preservation of Steam and Railroad Americana, the Steamtown Foundation for short. This non-profit organization guided the creation and operation of Steamtown USA. As a non-profit, the organization could now accept donations of railroad equipment. Nelson transferred a majority of his collection to the foundation and served as its acting chairman. However, Nelson was concerned about the limitations present at the North Walpole site. Despite receiving several attractive offers from cities across the U.S., such as Orlando, Florida, Honesdale, Pennsylvania, and Cincinnati, Ohio, Nelson opted to pursue a more local location. So, he began discussions with Vermont state officials to move Steamtown to Vermont. The Rutland Railroad had recently abandoned their entire system, including the Bellows Falls subdivision between Bellows Falls and Rutland. This appeared to be an ideal location for the new Steamtown. By the end of the year, Nelson had secured a new 18-acre site dubbed Riverside to build the museum, negotiated an operating agreement to run excursions over the former Rutland trackage, and established the Green Mountain Railroad, a freight railroad to serve the rail customers in the area and provide full-time employment for his staff. And most notably, Railway Valley 15 hitting the silver screen in the 1963 film, The Cardinal. (1964) began with a legal dispute over the Rutland trackage. The Green Mountain Railroad had been offered the freight business on the former Rutland Railroad, but the Boston and Maine wanted that business. The Boston and Maine also had an interest in the tracks to Rutland. Consequently, the Boston and Maine refused to move any of Nelson's equipment to the new Steamtown site. The Rutland Railroad had trackage rights on the Boston and Maine track, and they came to the rescue. They dispatched their only remaining locomotive, Alco RS1 number 405, to North Walpole. Under the cover of darkness, they retrieved number 15, coaches, and a caboose, and towed them to the Steamtown site. The 1964 excursion season began on June 4th. The 405 was eventually purchased by Nelson, and became the first engine on the roster of the Green Mountain Railroad. With the rocky start behind them, the remainder of 1964 was very productive. Work progressed on the creation of the Green Mountain Railroad to resume freight service in the area. The Boston and Maine finally agreed to move the rest of Nelson's equipment to the new Steamtown site. Canadian Pacific 1293, which had been purchased by Nelson the previous winter, was brought online and operated until the end of the season. This marked the first time the MS&N had two operational steam locomotives on their roster. Over 60,000 visitors attended the two operations, with 37,000 riding the MS&N excursions and 23,000 visiting Steamtown USA. To top things off, after several unsuccessful attempts, Nelson and the Foundation finally had a permanent home to operate and build Steamtown USA. By April of 1965, the Green Mountain Railroad began operating freight trains between Rutland and Bellows Falls. They interchanged with the Boston and Maine and Bellows Falls, and with the Vermont Railway and Delaware and Hudson and Rutland. 3 steam locomotives from Nelson's collection, Canadian National 89, Canadian Pacific 1246, and Canadian Pacific 1293, were selected as the first 3 steam engines to be part of the Green Mountain Railroad fleet. However, 1246 and 1293 had to sit out the 65 season. Despite being in relatively good condition, they had not been inspected according to the ICC-mandated inspection schedule. Consequently, they could not run again until those inspections had been completed. In May of 1965, Nelson purchased Canadian Pacific 462 Pacific number 1278 from the Canadian Pacific, bringing his roster of G5 Pacifics up to 3. 1278 was very similar to the New Haven I-5s, which Nelson had been enamored with as a child and became his favorite and personal locomotive. The locomotive was adorned with the MS&N logo, the only locomotive in his collection to ever wear the herald of the operation. With trains departing Riverside, the 65 season operated weekends only between May and June, and daily through mid-October, reverting back to weekends only for the remainder of the month. At the time, the Steamtown collection was still on display in North Walpole, but it wouldn't be long until the announcement was made by Nelson of the Foundation's plan to move Steamtown USA to Riverside. Between the fourth quarter of 1966 and the first quarter of 1967, construction of Phase 1 of Steamtown USA commenced. The initial phase consisted of storage tracks, a turntable, land preparation and infrastructure improvements at a cost of $250,000. Phase 2 was to have included the construction of the museum buildings, a 40-stall roundhouse alongside a dock and terminal for the planned steamboat operations, at an estimated cost of $697,625. The third and final phase, which Nelson thought would tie the museum together, was to be an authentic recreation of an 1890s New England village, complete with stores with amenities, and an electric trolley. Nelson's grand vision for Steamtown was for it to not only be a rare museum of static exhibits, but for it to be an immersive experience of 19th century life in New England. It is very possible that Nelson took inspiration from the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village located in Dearborn, Michigan. This new permanent Steamtown complex was scheduled to be completed by 1970. In the meantime, steam excursions continued with increasing ridership. Green Mountain Railroad number 89 and Nelson's 127 powered the trains, with both engines double-heading on fall foliage trips. Rahway Valley 15 powered a few of the season's excursions, serving Steamtown well before its flue time ran out the following year. Numerous fan trips were also operated over the Green Mountain Railroad and Vermont Railway to Bennington and Burlington, Vermont. In the fall of 1966, Nelson collaborated with New York commodities broker and fellow rail fan Ross Rowland to operate a series of fan trips in Pennsylvania for Rowland's newly formed High Iron Company with number 127. On the October 16th trip, between Jersey City, New Jersey and Jim Thorpe, PA, Nelson had the opportunity to fulfill a lifelong dream of his, to run a steam locomotive on the main line at track speed, remarking, "I have been dreaming all my life what it must be like to run at track speed, and now I know. I just had the best experience of my life." With his operations in Vermont well and truly secured, Nelson ran several excursions with number 127 across the Northeast throughout the spring and early summer of 1967. Site preparations at Riverside were progressing well, and a number of pieces of equipment were moved to the site from North Walpole. Excursions for the 1967 season departed Riverside, running to Chester, Vermont and back on weekends from May to June, with 3 trips per day. From June to Labor Day, 3 trains were run per day, 7 days a week. By this time, Nelson had begun to distance himself from the business affairs of the Foundation. He was hoping to find a new person to serve as the Foundation's chairman, so he could focus his attention on being an engineer for Steamtown. However, on August 31st, 1967, disaster struck. On that day, F. Nelson Blout was killed in a tragic plane crash while trying to make an emergency landing, at the age of 49. The loss of Nelson had a profound impact on Steamtown and his rail ventures. Suddenly, Steamtown's visionary leader was gone. Without Nelson's finances, leadership, and vision, Steamtown fell on hard times. They struggled to keep the massive collection maintained and operate seasonal excursions every year. Ultimately, Steamtown USA, the MS&N, and the Green Mountain Railroad parted ways, with each heading in different directions. Management of the Edaville Railroad, which had served as the inspiration for Steamtown, was handed over to Nelson's longtime friend, Fred Richardson. In the years that followed Richardson's tenure as general manager, the railroad continued to change hands and ownership teams. With Steamtown's main benefactor out of the picture, the museum ran into financial trouble. To combat this and keep the museum afloat, Steamtown leased out several pieces of equipment for either operation or display to various different museums and tourist railroads in the eastern United States. The Steamtown Foundation intended on building Nelson's ambitious Steamtown complex. However, without the funding and Nelson's leadership, Steamtown USA was not built. In an effort to pay tribute to Nelson, Canadian Pacific 1246 was adorned with F. Nelson Blout nameplates, and a special weekend of Steamtown excursions were run in memory of Nelson. Following Nelson's death, title to equipment owned by Nelson and the Green Mountain Railroad was transferred to the Steamtown Foundation. Without its chief visionary, leader, and financier, Steamtown faced an uncertain future as it entered the 1970s.
Wheels are turning, the bridges are burning, and the light turns night into day. It's a time to stake it, or make it or break it, for the time flies quickly away. Oh, it's a time to start making your mark, and it's a time to get in the game. Everybody's moving, nothing stays the same.
Now without a leader, the Steamtown Foundation needed to find a new person to lead the organization. The Steamtown Foundation appointed Edgar T. Meade as the new director of the Steamtown Foundation in October of 1967. Meade's first priority was to ensure Steamtown's future in Vermont. In short order, Meade named Reynolds J. Ano as the curator of the Steamtown collection. With a new leader at the helm, Steamtown pressed onward. However, it became apparent that Vermont was not well equipped for the high-volume tourist attraction that Steamtown needed to be. The state of Vermont was not an avid supporter of Steamtown, forbidding Steamtown from putting up a proper sign outside the front gate, nor any billboards along the neighboring highways. To make matters worse, the energy crisis had a detrimental impact on tourism, greatly reducing attendance at Steamtown. The search for a new location began in earnest in the 1970s. During Meade's tenure at Steamtown, he focused his attention on protecting the Steamtown collection from the ravages of the New England winters, covering a large portion of the collection with numerous shelters. An attempt to bring in more visitors came in 1973, with the creation of Railfans Day. This one-day event eventually evolved into the popular Railfans Weekend. These events included excursions, photo run-bys, and a night photo session conducted by a railfan and railroad editor, Jim Boyd. Meade led Steamtown until 1973, when he decided to resign. Following Meade's departure from Steamtown, Robert Barbera became the new director of the Steamtown Foundation. Barbera had an analytical and economic approach, and he initiated a successful marketing campaign, significantly improving attendance at Steamtown. With the bicentennial of the U.S. and the bicentennial of the Vermont Republic around the corner, the state of Vermont proposed running a 2-year event with special steam-powered trains crisscrossing the state. Initially, plans had called for 3 trains, but the state could only afford to operate 1 train. The program was called the Vermont Bicentennial Steam Expedition, with numerous trips scheduled throughout the summer and fall of 1976. After several months of planning and prep work, the Vermont Bicentennial Steam Expedition kicked off on July 1, 1976, with the 1293 on the head end of the train. Throughout the summer and fall of 1976, the Bicentennial train carried 23,000 people. However, despite the monumental amount of work put into the project, it was a financial failure. Even though the program was not a financial success, it allowed Steamtown to bolster its operating fleet by putting 1293 and 9 coaches back in service. At the 1978 Railfan Weekend, Canadian Pacific 2317 debuted on the Green Mountain Line and went on to regularly pull Steamtown excursions for many years. Despite the efforts to keep Steamtown afloat, a sharp drop in attendance put Steamtown in a very difficult situation. Robert Barbera resigned in 1980, and Stuart Carter took over as interim leader. Carter focused his attention on improving the appearance of the Steamtown grounds, greatly improving the condition of the collection. Later that year, Don Ball Jr., a well-known railroad author, was brought in as the new leader of Steamtown. However, Despite their best efforts to keep Nelson's dream alive in the New England woods, Steamtown made the difficult decision to move the museum to a new location. The foundation looked at potential sites in Pennsylvania, Florida, and New York. They ultimately decided that Scranton, Pennsylvania offered the best opportunity for a new home. A series of farewell to Vermont trips took place in the fall of 1983, and the final trip ran on October 23, 1983. F. Nelson Blout's legacy of steam in New England had finally run out of steam. It was time to move the operation to a new city and start building a new legacy. Following the conclusion of the final season in Vermont, several pieces from Nelson's collection were sold to raise funds for the move to Scranton. 40 locomotives and 60 cars were retained by the foundation and were shipped by rail to the new Steamtown site in Scranton, Pennsylvania between 1983 and 1985. The new Steamtown site was the former Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad yard in Scranton. Steamtown negotiated trackage rights to operate excursions over a 13-mile line from Scranton to Moscow, Pennsylvania. Economic forecasts estimated that Steamtown would bring in 200,000 to 400,000 visitors to the city every year. In anticipation of this economic boom, the city spent $13 million to renovate the former Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad station, transforming it into a Hilton hotel. Don Ball Jr. led Steamtown until 1984 when he resigned. James Gillespie of Scranton was named as the new general manager of Steamtown. In 1984, Steamtown's first season in Scranton, the 1246 and 2317 were assigned to the excursion trains and operated excursions from Scranton to Elmhurst, Pennsylvania. For the 1985 and 1986 seasons, the Steamtown excursions operated from Scranton to Moscow, Pennsylvania. Despite the high hopes the Steamtown Foundation had by moving to Scranton, the foundation was still losing money each year, with less than stellar attendance numbers. The cost of the move to Scranton, coupled with the costs involved to prepare the new site for operation, was more than the foundation could handle, and they were strapped for cash. However, the financial issues were not the only problem. In Vermont, the Steamtown excursions provided the passengers with picturesque views of farms, cornfields, and covered bridges. Unfortunately, the Steamtown excursions in Pennsylvania passed by an enormous junkyard, which was not a very pleasant sight. In April of 1985, Norfolk Southern traded Nickel Plate Road GP9 number 514 and Wabash SW8 number 132 to Steamtown for Norfolk and Western 1218. In January of 1986, Jerry Joe Jacobson traded Baldwin Locomotive Works number 26 to Steamtown for Canadian National 1551. In March of 1986, after months of public criticism, James Gillespie was fired. John M. Hart stepped in as interim leader. Hart's goal was to display the many artifacts in the Steamtown collection to the public. Despite Steamtown's struggles and management shakeups, members of Steamtown's board of directors refused to let F. Nelson Blout's dream die. In an effort to save Steamtown from an uncertain future, and at the behest of the Steamtown Foundation, Pennsylvania Congressman and Scranton native Joseph M. McDade led an effort in Congress to approve $8 million in federal funding to establish Steamtown as a National Historic Site. For the 1986 excursion season, 2317 was cosmetically altered to look like a Lackawanna steam locomotive. In July of 1986, Southern Railway Schools Class locomotive number 926 Repton, which had been purchased by Steamtown in April of 1967, was put back into service. It pulled numerous excursions for Steamtown that year, including a pair of double-headed excursions with 2317. In 1987, Steamtown traded 1278 to the Gettysburg Railroad for Canadian National 3254. Steamtown cosmetically altered the locomotive to look like a Lackawanna steam locomotive and was renumbered 1271. For the 1987 season, the excursions were extended another 19 miles to Pocono Summit, Pennsylvania. The station at Pocono Summit was restored and repainted, complete with a gift shop and picnic area, and the fares to ride the excursions were reduced to a more affordable price. However, Despite the Foundation's best efforts, the 1987 season was the end of the line for the Steamtown Foundation. They had run out of money and were $2.2 million in debt. They declared bankruptcy in December of 1987, and the Foundation dissolved in the fall of 1988. The 1988 excursion season was canceled. Instead of operating excursions, the National Park Service operated shuttle trips from the Lackawanna Hilton Hotel to the Steamtown Rail Yard with a British Leyland LEV2 rail bus in July and August of 1988. Upon arrival at the Steamtown Rail Yard, passengers got a walking tour of the property, while park rangers explained the future plans for the buildings and amenities. Shuttle trips with the rail bus to and from the rail yard lasted 1 month. However, a broken fuel pump ended operations with the rail bus, with it being replaced with one of Steamtown's diesels and a passenger car. Later in 1988, the collection was purchased by the National Park Service. During 1987 and 1988, the Steamtown collection was extensively researched by the National Park Service. The results of their research were published in 1991 under the title of the Steamtown Special History Study. The study included historical information on each piece and contained information about whether it should be part of a government-owned collection. Equipment that did not meet the recommendations of the report were sold or traded for equipment that was more historically significant to the area. During this time, numerous pieces of Canadian Railroad equipment that were originally purchased by F. Nelson Blout were de-accessed from the collection in an effort to service the Foundation's mounting debts. In 1989, excursions resumed. The original Scranton to Moscow route was in need of bridge repairs, so the excursions operated over the former Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western from Scranton to Kingsley, Pennsylvania. That route crossed the historic Tunkhannock Viaduct, which provided a unique attraction for the passengers. For the 1989 excursion season, Canadian Pacific 2317 and Canadian National 3254 were put back to their historically correct Canadian Pacific and Canadian National liveries. The Steamtown National Historic Site project, which had ballooned to $60 million, broke ground on April 13, 1990. This nationally funded Steamtown complex set out to reconstruct numerous structures, along with the creation of a museum, a theater, and much, much more. From 1990 to 1995, the National Park Service spent $80 million to rehabilitate the site. They transformed it from a derelict rail yard into a visitor-friendly railroad museum. While construction of the Steamtown site progressed from year to year, Steamtown continued regularly scheduled excursions from Scranton to Kingsley, Pennsylvania. 1992 would mark the final year of excursions to Kingsley, Pennsylvania. With the bridge repairs completed, excursions returned to the Pocono Summit Line in 1993. The Steamtown National Historic Site project was not without its critics. There were many people who were very critical of the federally funded museum project, including select congressmen who wanted to sunset the project. Don Snoddy, curator of the Union Pacific Historical Museum, called Steamtown a boondoggle from the beginning. Lynn Moedinger of the Strasburg Railroad, another critic of the Steamtown project, wasn't pleased to see limited taxpayer dollars being used on superfluous projects, nor was he pleased to see the government competing with private sector operators. Despite all the critics, work progressed steadily each year. As the project neared completion, the grand opening of the Steamtown National Historic Site was set for July of 1995. For the grand opening of Steamtown brought in several guest steam locomotives. Milwaukee Road 484 number 261, Reading Blue Mountain and Northern 462 number 425, Susquehanna 282 number 142, and Louisville and Beaver River Shea number 8 were on hand to celebrate the grand opening. The guest locomotives were joined by Steamtown's own Baldwin Locomotive Works number 26, Canadian National 3254, and Canadian Pacific 2317. The Steamtown grand opening kicked off on July 1st of 1995, with speeches by park officials and dignitaries, and a grand parade of steam. At last, following nearly 3 decades of numerous attempts with varying levels of success, Steamtown finally had a permanent home.
Before we introduce our next speaker, I would like to acknowledge the presence of an important and distinguished group of visitors, and that is the family and friends of the late F. Nelson Blout. The collection of steam locomotives and cars in Steamtown would not exist had it not been for Mr. Blout. From the 30s until his untimely death in 1967, he labored to establish Steamtown USA, which ultimately made its way to Bellows Falls, Vermont. It was in 1984 that that collection came to Scranton. What happens today is a full realization of Nelson Blout's dream. The collection has been preserved. Steamtown now has a permanent home, a roundhouse, and museum. May we thank him as we acknowledge the presence of his family and his friends here today.
Today, Steamtown is maligned by some rail fans who have called for it to be privatized. With Blout at the helm, he pushed hard to bring his dream to life. His enthusiasm and passion for trains drove Steamtown to great success. When Nelson died, there was no one who had the needed funds to take the reins that had the same enthusiasm and drive that Nelson had, to realize Nelson's ambitious plans for Steamtown and keep Steamtown going. In the decades that followed, various management teams tried to keep Steamtown going, but they were unable to recapture the magic. These unsuccessful attempts drove Steamtown to declare bankruptcy in 1987. Pennsylvania Congressman Joseph McDade saw potential in Steamtown. He thought he could breathe new life into the museum through the creation of the National Historic Site, which would finally give Steamtown a permanent home. Although Steamtown is not exactly as Nelson had envisioned, Steamtown still makes steady progress each year through the efforts of the Iron Horse Society and Steamtown NHS volunteers. Steamtown remains an everlasting monument to the preservation efforts of F. Nelson Blout. The story of Steamtown is one of spirit, optimism, and purpose, of one man's dream to preserve an era of railroading that was slipping through the fingers of many in the 1950s. Above all else, F. Nelson Blout had the foresight like no other, saving numerous pieces of railroad equipment from the scrapper's torch, and should be commended for the immense amount of work he put into saving that equipment. His story is an important one that shouldn't be buried or lost to time, but should be a story that is told to scores of people. Although Nelson does not have a huge visible presence in the park, he is still the cornerstone of Steamtown. Had it not been for F. Nelson Blout, hundreds of pieces of railroad equipment from the Americas and Europe would have never seen another chance at life beyond their working days. Thank you, Nelson, for all that you did for rail preservation and your undying efforts to save the vanishing age of steam, steel, and streamliners.
Everybody's moving across the town. The skyline grows and the cut of the clothes is enough to turn you around. Oh, the future is just an hour away and the hearts of youth are aflame. Everybody's moving, nothing stays the same. Wheels are turning, the bridges are burning, and the light turns night into day. It's a time to stake it, or make it or break it, for the time flies quickly away. Oh, it's a time to start making your mark, and it's a time to get in the game. Everybody's moving, nothing stays the same. Upwards, outwards, all around, reaching for the sky. Rivers are highway and roads are steel. It's a time to be alive. Oh, ain't no reaching river that we can't cross, no giant too tall to be slain. Everybody's moving, nothing stays the same. Nothing stays the same. Tell you, nothing stays the same. Nothing stays the same. But nothing stays the same. Yep. Nothing stays the same. Let me tell you, nothing stays the same. Let me tell you, nothing stays the same.
Hear the train roaring down the track. a picturesque thing, and I think this is one of the things that makes the steam locomotive so colorful, to see those wheels and rods flipping around and to hear the sounds and smell the exhaust, all the things that go with it. I don't think the steam locomotive can be beaten nostalgia in any way. I've been an airplane pilot for 21 years, and I love airplanes, but they don't hold a candle to running a fast passenger engine.